Lose your right arm on the job in 1680, and what happens next depends entirely on who you work for. If you're a sailor in a legitimate navy or merchant fleet, you're likely discharged into poverty with little more than luck and charity. But if you sail with pirates, the murderers, the outlaws, the enemies of all mankind, you collect a payout. A fixed one, written down. 600 pieces of 8 for a right arm, roughly what an honest sailor might earn in years. The most lawless men on earth had workers' compensation, and that's only the start of it. We know this because people who sailed with them wrote it down. Alexandre Exquemelin, a surgeon who spent years among the Buccaneers of the Caribbean, published an account in 1678 describing their system. Before any voyage, the crew drew up written articles that every man signed. The articles set the pay shares, the rules, the punishments, and an injury schedule. So much for a lost right arm, a different amount for a left, set sums for a leg, an eye, a finger. Compensation was paid out of the loot before anyone else got a share. The wounded got paid first, and the articles went further. Pirate captains were elected by vote of the crew. They could be deposed, also by vote, and it happened regularly. In battle, the captain's word was law, but in daily life he ate the same food and slept in the same quarters as everyone else, because the men had learned on legitimate ships what happens when a captain holds absolute power: tyranny, starvation rations, and the lash. To keep captains honest, the crews separately elected a quartermaster to control the treasure and represent the men, a genuine check on executive power, and the pay structure would embarrass a modern corporation. A pirate captain typically received about 2 shares to an ordinary crewman's one, not 200 times the median. 2, written constitutions, elected leaders, separation of powers, compensation for workplace injury. This is a century before the French Revolution, on ships crewed by escaped indentured servants, runaway slaves, and press-ganged sailors, many of them men the legitimate world had treated as property, which is exactly why it worked. Nothing about this was idealism. The economist Peter Leeson, who studied the pirate articles in detail, makes the point bluntly. Pirates weren't building utopia, they were solving business problems. A pirate ship was a floating startup where every worker was heavily armed, nobody could call the police, and profits depended on men charging into cannon fire. If your crew doesn't trust the pay split, they mutiny. If they fear the captain, they defect. If a man knows losing an arm means starving, he doesn't board the enemy ship. Every democratic feature answered a practical threat. Fairness wasn't the goal. Fairness was the technology. Compare that with the legitimate world these men escaped. On merchant ships, captains held near absolute power, wages were routinely withheld, beatings were legal, and a crippled sailor was somebody else's problem. Pirate crews were full of volunteers from captured merchant ships for a reason. When given the choice between lawful misery and criminal fairness, sailors chose fairness at the price of a noose. Now, before this sounds too romantic, pirates were violent men who robbed, tortured, and killed. The democracy stopped at the rail of their own ship. The people they attacked got no vote. This isn't a story about pirates being secretly good. It's stranger than that. It's a story about how even predators, when forced to cooperate with no state, no courts, and no law to lean on, independently invented the same machinery we call civilization: constitutions, elections, checks on power, and a safety net. The men who wrote those articles couldn't rely on loyalty, tradition, or authority. Their system had to actually work, or they died. Meanwhile, the legitimate world systems ran on birthright and obedience for another century before the revolutions came. Revolutions demanding, in essence, what pirates had already signed at sea: consent of the governed and a fair share. So the outlaws got there first, not because they were better men, but because they couldn't afford illusions. Which leaves a question that outlives the golden age of piracy: how much of what we call order is actually fairness, and how much is just authority that's never had to earn it?